My reflections are based on our experience, built on critical research, graduate teaching, worker and community-based incidence programs for the defense and advancement of worker, community, and nature's rights. My talk is not a statement of data about inequality and a specific policy and agency discussion, not only because facts don't necessarily alone change our minds, but because my aim is to build awareness about the priority of conceptual and practical debate, urgently needed about lever ideas and emancipatory action. We all live in a world of concentrated opulence and technology in some regions and for certain minorities, and at the same time of ever-worsening poverty, needs, and unhealthiness for the vast majorities. So we scientists and scholars should ask ourselves, what can we do in such a dreadful scenario? What is the real use of scientific conferences among responsible scholars and experts? And the obvious, but at the same time difficult to build on answer, is to take distance from passive or functional stances, practices, and policies, and enhance our critical capacity to scientifically denounce the structural basis of a world controlled by corporate greed, proposing at the same time new, sustainable, democratic, solidary, and healthy modes of living. To serve the purpose of dealing with this challenge, I will be using some categories and reasoning that pertain to Latin American critical science tradition. They may not sound familiar or medical sometimes to you, but in this short time, I will try to explain why they contribute to development of lever transformative knowledge in the health field. My main statement then is the need for transformative research on social determination of the health gap. And from this derives key arguments. Some fundamental questions that arise from this general statement. Clearly, the need to clearly define what is real critical thinking and transformative research, understanding social determination of health in the field of critical epidemiology, reframing the health gap theory, and analyzing the much-needed convergence of academic and community critical thinking. So the fundamental questions that arise from our general statement are: why the urge for transformative research focus on health gap in societies in this 21st century? What is real transformative research? What is transformative critical perspective of health and its gaps? How does the social determination paradigm act to transform functionist public health into an emancipatory collective health? So why the urge? Why the urge to talk about transformative science, transformative research focused on health gap in our societies? We're living a moment of global crisis of life and health, but we ask, what is the essence of the crisis of life and health in the 21st century? If the concentrating and excluding capital market economy was always destructive of life, what is the uniqueness of today's dominant society? The wellness and optimal life in a healthy society presuppose what I call the 4 S's of life, which are structurally denied today. First, a sustainable economy for the reproduction of human beings, a sovereign libertarian identity and culture, solidary politics and agency for equitable relations, and integral human and natural biosecurity for a healthy society, nature, metabolism, healthy social spaces, and modes of living. But precisely those 4 S's are systematically destroyed in the dominant relations of the capitalist society, which is geared around the process of capital accumulation and which is accelerated in present times. This acceleration of capitalism obeys to 3 main mechanisms. First, the capital convergence for productivist uses of technologies, dispossession or appropriation and concentration of live goods like land, water, genome, and general biota, and shock as an opportunistic exploitation way to take advantage of disasters, pandemics, and fear to boost the profit. This is not essentially or basically a problem that can be described as a gap between the wealthy and the poor, between the empowered and the vulnerable. It is a social relation where the existence and the reproduction of concentrated wealth depends on the existence of poorness. A gap is merely a deriving expression of that social relation, an indicator, not a first-stance analysis category. From that perspective, it seems that the underlying fake truth is that there is a gap between the well-doing, the wealthy corporations that have attained progress and are doing well, versus the backward, less developed communities, urban and rural, that are stuck behind. This way of seeing things is fake truth. Let's analyze this problem through an example. The paradox of big-scale food industry. Supposedly, food industry is developed to feed, but it has become a source of hunger and unhealthiness. Agribusiness has become a critical process of structural unhealthiness and contributes to what I have described as a global toxic bonfire. There is a contradiction between 2 ways of understanding the production of food: agriculture. An unhealthy agriculture, which is destructive of the 4 S's of life, and an agriculture for life that is protective of those 4 S's, which you could broadly describe as agroecology, agroecological agriculture. And in the first case, the trend, the essence, is the monopolization logic of land, seeds, and water resources. And on the other side, you have a view of agriculture as a space of solidarity, of sharing, of cooperation to develop fertility. But we are experiencing the domination of the economy of death, of the economy of destruction of the 4 S's, and this is characterized by a global extreme crisis of sustainability of life. I have taken the example that I found in an essay of one of my students in the PhD program in Quito about the water drainage in Plachimada. She presented this essay analyzing a very, very important example of what I am talking about as the agriculture or the industry of death. And it is the case of the water crisis that was produced when liberal market reforms package were applied, that was introduced in the mid-'80s, and companies like Coca-Cola and others competed for a profitable water market, understanding water as a commodity and not as a source of life, of course. And the water supply to urban areas was privatized. The consumption of the middle class in India increased. The market opportunities were favorable to the companies. And of course, Coca-Cola withdraws from the communities only after destroying the natural replenishment cycle of the aquifers. When nature does not serve it, then it seeks another community. And of course, this Coca-Cola annual production occurs precisely in the 4 months of March, April, May, June, exactly when the groundwater levels are at their lowest and water scarcity for the community at its acutest. In this case, the International Beverage Company, which owns almost 400 brands in approximately 200 countries, more than 1 billion cans or bottles of Coca-Cola are consumed every day around the world. In other words, 12,000 containers are consumed every second. Coca-Cola currently faces multiple accusations for dehydrating communities, drying farmers' wells, and destroying local agriculture. Other conflicts, of course, are labor conflicts at the supplying plants in other countries of the world, like Colombia, Turkey, Guatemala, Russia. So this is the case of a view of economy based on extractivism, which implies the extreme appropriation and concentration of live goods, land, water, genome, and in general of the biotope and biocenosis, is clearly a health hazard. This is not the discourse exclusively of economy. This is not the discourse exclusively of economical theory. This is the discourse of health. This is the discourse of collective health. It pertains to our field. This is not strange to our field. This is absolutely necessary for real, serious collective health. Besides, it is not merely or primarily an ethical or cultural issue. It is mainly an objective material conditioning of life, and therefore it matters. It matters to us, specialists in the health field. And the myth of progressive neo-productivism, like as there would be possible a redistributive governance and the entelechy of top to bottom dripping of progress, like there would be a good extractivism which pays for social expenditures and provides jobs and progress. This is fake truth. And this implies the systematic destruction of the possibilities of life in the planet, not only of human health. So the obvious question which relates to the untangling of the fake truth of that sort of progress is there essentially a gap between the small family, supposedly backward producers that feed our people, that share seeds, that protect the water and ecosystems and avoid waste? Nearly 60% in my country of the food is produced by these small farmers, these small family farmers, many of them doing procedures of agroecology. And on the other side, the affluent rich that pour chemicals in the environment, monopolize land, water seeds, apply dangerous high-tech uses for expanding profit. Of course, there is a gap in rentability and therefore income. But who is sustainable in this picture? Who is sovereign? Who is solidary? Who is biosecure? In other words, where does the chance of life stand? In the work of the industrious, poor, small, medium producers, or in these big companies that say they're feeding the world under the myth of the need for toxic chemicals that they apply intensively in the green revolution model? Who is then backward? In that context, another invariable victim is the second S, sovereignty. Not only the broad laws of sovereignty that big companies impose in aspects like the autonomous political ruling of our countries, or the control of seeds of our farmers and peoples all over the world, but also the forced disappearance of health autonomical governance. Destruction of sovereignty penetrates the international health cooperation field. Governments used to conduct sovereign WHO negotiations. Under neoliberal global rule, corporations penetrated international governing bodies and took over the international organization and government of WHO. Financial control is essential to this loss of sovereignty. According to WHO reports, in the case of the years 2012-2013, amounted to $3,959 million US, according to the General Council, 18% is financed by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So I suppose that 20% financing implies something in the governance. If we add that the fact that according to the Melinda and Gates Foundation annual budget report for those same years, its budget for those years amounted to $3,635 million US. So who's controlling international governance of health? Are we sovereign? Are we making decisions? Is our people making decisions? Are our governments making decisions? And the so-called BRICS countries, the emerging economies, let's talk about them and nutrition. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS. In spite of their evident historical and cultural differences, they share important characteristics which potentiate capital accumulation, acceleration, and destructive modes of living in the capitalist civilization. Extended territories, immense national markets, powerful ruling groups eager to expand growth under inequitable social relations, monopolizing vital resources, fast expansion of unhealthy consumption patterns for the poor, all of which enhance favorable scenarios for unhealthy living modes, food patterns, and environments. They constitute a gigantic socioeconomic machinery for forest deterioration, multiplication of social inequity, and unhealthy contrast of living conditions. Just to take an example, this nice work by a dear friend of mine, Geraldo Otero, and colleagues, called The Neoliberal Diet and Inequality in the United States, clearly states that while upper income groups have had increased access to higher quality foods, lower to middle income class diets are heavily focused on energy dense fares. This neoliberal diet clearly associated with the proliferation of obesity that disproportionately affects the poor. We provide a critical review of this debate about obesity from within the critical camp in food studies between individual focused and structural perspectives. So this neoliberal diet, this neoliberal mode of living in the BRICS, we cannot seriously understand the 21st century epidemic of diabetes, obesity, and related chronic diseases without seriously observing the global construction of the neoliberal diet, and I again would say the neoliberal mode of living. Culture is important, but it operates through and linked to the socioeconomic patterns. Precisely, the BRICS countries hold very high prevalence and incidence rates of diabetes. In comparison to their starting levels, the fastest growing of prevalence and incidence. The problem concentrates in the bigger modernized conurban spaces of those countries. The neoliberal way of eating is not solely a problem of diabetogenic diet, but it is a complex multidimensional process that involves the logic and structure of food production and distribution, the modes of eating inscribed in the living modes of different social groups with their typical vulnerabilities differentiated by class, gender, ethnic relations. Brazil, the big brother of harmful agriculture in Latin America. If you look at the data of the lately published dossier of agrochemicals in Brazil, and you see the right column of this table, you can see the percentage of samples of food distributed in a national study on Brazil. They have very high rates of contamination, all of them, getting to 90% of samples contaminated by dangerous chemicals. If you look at the map of Brazil and the agrochemical contamination of the water network, both superficial and aquifers are contaminated, and it's widely expanded all over the country. And it goes even to penetrate breast milk. Breast milk, in the sampling that was done in one of the studies published in this dossier, up to 6 types of chemicals were present in breast milk of women exposed to chemicals in the areas of Brazil. So we're talking of serious business of health. But of course not. Of course, there are other people struggling for the other agriculture, the agriculture of life, the agriculture of health, agroecology. Those are experiences in Brazil that are trying to counteract this monstrous deterioration of the nature of agriculture, and it is possible to change things. Precisely, this is an example taken from Ecuador. In 5 years, you can reduce 71.5% the wasteful consumption of water of industry, of agriculture and industry, by doing things the right way, without having profit-geared logic, but having protecting of life. And you can reduce in 5 years, the red line is toxic chemicals, and instead replace them with biological control of the plagues for agro-industry. So this is perfectly possible. But of course you have to have life in your mind and not profit and greed. And here's also with the fertilization process. Instead of using chemicals, you can reduce them and change them systematically to a more productive and of course a different type of logic. So we need critical thinking for transformative science. And when we say critical thinking, of course it is important to recognize what Foucault said in his Art of Critique, that it is important to reinvent epistemological certainties, that it is important to discern and unveil mechanisms of coercion and thinking, interrogate the politics of truth, the right to question truth, as truth operates through power, the transgressing one's limits towards this subjugation, and deconstructing limits to our subjecthood. This is all important. But I think to complete the cycle of an emancipatory critique, not only criticizing data of social and epidemiological inequality, not only criticizing the epistemical cultural conditions, but because that would be incomplete and uprooted, we need an emancipatory scientific criticism which implies questioning the material basis of society, the structural basis of society, the nature of capital reproduction and accumulation, which is expanding its logic, its perverse logic of death towards the functioning of the whole society. A comprehensive view of critical thinking, therefore, implies a philosophy that questions the material objective as well as the cultural subjective fundaments of the society. Therefore, it questions the mode of dominant social reproduction. It implies a broad intercultural metacritique. Concomitantly, it questions the dominant practices and ethos. And what is this formulation of a metacritique? It implies what my dear friend Boaventura Santos calls the ecology of knowledges, and I prefer to call a metacritique. Metacritique, which implies putting together all the powerful ideas of political organizations of the left, feminist organizations, ethnic organizations, ecological activists, health activists, and of course, what is our doing? What is our field with the academic struggles, of course. And then each one of them have their own approaches, their own emphases, but all these can provide an articulated metacritique that is needed to really fully understand the perversity of present accelerated capitalism. So this is not juxtaposing, sequencing and coordinating knowledge. It implies transcending, transgressing and transforming knowledge, which is the difference between a multidisciplinary approach with a real transdisciplinary approach, which implies a profound respect for the knowledge of the simple people of our people, and not the arrogance of an academy that is considered above. We are the gods of knowledge. We know everything, and we have to spell it out to our people. And this irrespectful, arrogant way is absolutely the negation of the essence of real and transformative knowledge. And the axis of transformation, acting over health as an object, acting against the unhealthy existing conditions of persons and societies, but at the same time acting against ideas of individual and collective subjects which are backward, which are obstaculizing the understanding of the essence of our societies. So this implies a paradigm clash. It's a struggle of ideas that is why we have changed the concept of public health to the integral concept of collective health. And the health, of course, related to the individual and collective practices. And here is when a renewed importance is to the words of Virchow, when he said, preserving health and preventing disease requires full and unlimited democracy and radical measures rather than mere palliatives. And mere palliatives are spelled out every day through the bureaucratic conception of public health. And of course, radical critical measures require radical thinking. You cannot do radical measures with conventional thinking, with conventional public health. So in Latin America, the development of critical epidemiology has been one of the lines of struggle, and it's very important for that movement, the understanding of social determination that is the basis of critical epidemiology. The construction of critical, metacritical science and health, in other words, and the case of critical epidemiology, which is not social epidemiology. Social epidemiology, we need to go beyond the tautological significance of social epidemiology. This is kind of like saying we're going to do a social sociology. That's not the right. That's a tautology. Epidemiology is always social. All epidemiological paradigms are social, but few are critical, and that's the essence of the debate. 3 books have been published in Latin America about the difference between social determinants of health and social determination of health. This is a very important difference. One was published in Brazil in 2010, in Mexico 2011, in Colombia 2015. And critical epidemiology implies theoretic and methodological ruptures. I'm not going to be able to deal in profundity this differentiation between determinants and determination. I'm leaving my presentation here if you want to go over it in detail. If you can have it in the web, that would be wonderful also. And main conceptual ruptures that are implied in critical epidemiology is breaking the knowledge illusion of linear reductionist thinking. Linear reductionist thinking that can be very fancy mathematically and very sophisticated quantitative approaches. I don't have anything against mathematics. I am a mathematics user, but I'm not talking about the critique of mathematics and quantitative analysis, which is fundamental. I'm critiquing linear reductionist mathematical analysis and epidemiology, which is imprisoned in the Cartesian conception, a reductionist conception of inductivism, which breaks the world, atomizes the world, and then tries to link those parts in a conjunction. And those parts can be sophisticatedly distributed in factors, usually called risk factors, and they comply constellations of risk factors that can be nicely packed in a principal component analysis, of course, and it functions perfectly. But it breaks out the reality and it separates evidences, because the risk factor logic, let's see it applied in diabetes. When you want to understand from this perspective of epidemiology diabetes type 2, the risk of type 2 diabetes is determined by an interplay of genetic and metabolic factors. And this is a quote from the report, the diabetes, the risk factor, the global report on diabetes of WHO. It says, the risk of type 2 diabetes is determined by an interplay of genetic and metabolic factors, ethnicity, family history of diabetes, and previous gestation of diabetes combined with older age, overweight and obesity, unhealthy diet, physical inactivity, and smoking to increase risk. Of course, these are elements that participate in the process, but if you explain diabetes through these parts, atomized as such, and you try to build a mathematical, formal arrangement of the parts, then you miss the whole picture, because you are working with the peak of the iceberg, the isolated empirical evidences that you mathematically confront, but you're missing the social determination, the roots of the health determination, which is in the base of society, and which implies this relationship with the structural functioning of society that explains the processes that appear as phenomena in the empirical strata. So, conventional epidemiology is peak of the iceberg epidemiology. Critical epidemiology links both elements to understand reality. And epidemiological process vision is very different, like when within Pradeep et al., when in this recent article says diabetes, a major lifestyle disorder, has become a global burden and the prevalence rates are rising steeply in developing economies. Rapid socioeconomic transition with urbanization and industrialization are the main causes for the global diabetes epidemic. This is completely an important process approach, integral process approach, and not the one that we were describing previously of conventional risk factor epidemiology, where much of the gap theory is built on this empirical approach. So we're trying to change this conception of factors and causes to processes and determination, understanding processes and not factors. In dengue, we can go over and say, well, we have all these variables that explain the outcome variable, which is the frequency and probability of cases of dengue, of course. And you can, and once you have this nice regression model where you have the variance coefficients clearly stated, and you define through that the priorities of public health, then you're missing the whole picture. Because dengue in my country, let me show you briefly. When we look at dengue from an integral perspective, in the case of Machala is the capital city of so this is the city of Machala. And this is the Pacific Ocean that you see here. All these were mangroves, but now it's agribusiness of shrimp production, shrimp pools, and all this is an ocean of banana. Ecuador is the main producer of banana in the world. And this ocean of banana implies the agriculture of chemical intense agriculture through airplanes. And when you see this, in order to have that ocean of banana, you have to condense. This was 1994, one area. And you see all these little properties, agricultural properties, units of production. And 10 years after, all of this is owned by 4 companies. So the monopolization of land, water, etc. is necessary to produce this ocean of banana, which implies massive contamination, chemicals, plastics, macro biodiversity, degraded soils, compaction, loss of micro biodiversity also, water depletion, and of course warming, climate warming, the famous climate warming. There it is. You have a formula for climate warming with this furnace that is produced massively. And this destroys the agricultural life, that banana can be produced through a completely different system. And what we're doing with epidemiology is to relate all these elements and understanding that nature and society, the broader society, the particular groups of society and the individuals, if you link all these elements, then you can get all the relations of the processes that are related to dengue. I don't have time to stick with the details of the example, but then you can even understand why the types of breeding zones of the cities can be explained by social class, which is clearly related to things. So the dengue transmission is a complex socially determined process, because the infective sources are determined socially, the exposure, vulnerability, and distribution patterns, the public policies and agency applied, the construction of coping systems, the social natural metabolism, etc. So big-scale agribusiness monopolies operate as giant climate furnaces, toxic climate warming mechanisms, breeding systems, and predator mosquitoes patterns and habits transformed. And our research is demonstrating that if you understand things like, for instance, thermal curves, when you this is an area of agroecological production of banana, and this is an area of convention. I don't know if you can notice the uniformity, absolute uniformity of this area versus the diversity. Well, here is when we measure by robot aerial measuring the temperature, you see that this is a cold area and this is a warming area, clearly. And the grids that you can compare, this can be all mathematically compared, but it's demonstrating that these enormous territories of monopoly, agricultural monopoly, which are huge, immense, are furnaces. And when they use chemicals, then it's a toxic bonfire. And we work with the people in understanding these differences, trying to demonstrate that you can produce safely, respecting the forests and not destroying them systematically. So understanding needs to go beyond causal epidemiology. I don't have time. You can go over the details of this relationship. This is our model of understanding the health field in a way that links both the society and nature through a metabolism. And when society, with its model, implies impacts on the social classes in its modes of living, and the social classes with their gender and ethnic relations are related to the individuals, there is a complex process of multidimensional analysis, and all these pertains to the health field, and you have to connect all of them like processes. And of course, this implies understanding this with political economy, critical sociology, critical anthropology, and clinical knowledge, and of course political ecology, which is what composes the tools of critical epidemiology to relate those dimensions of reality. Many details that I cannot go over, so we need to reframe the health gap theory. And we need to understand that gap as a mean differentials or gap as a contrast of healthiness of processes. It's a gap of processes, it's a contrast of processes, or it's a difference of means. When you look at the peak of the iceberg, then you concentrate in means and empirical differences. But when you understand the social determination, you make the difference, or you contrast structural qualitative power relations. That is the importance part of the picture. And this changes gap as indicators, gap analysis as indicators, differentiated, empirical indicators, or gap as contrast of inequity. The convergence, finally, of academic and community critical thinking is crucial. The challenge of intercultural knowledge building, which implies having a clear project of emancipatory project to defend the forests, a block of affected workers and communities to participate, and a critical science and instrumental resources to operate the movement of these elements to be able to establish. The paradigm of social determinations is reinforced by intercultural critical knowledge construction, which for the academic scenario implies facing mainstream academic illiteracy and disregard and epistemicide. This is what dominant academia, arrogant academia does. Academic illiteracy, disregard, and epistemicide. Critical social determination perspective is important. Powerful indigenous philosophy and knowledge about Mother Nature is absolutely crucial. And the intercultural construction of knowledge, respectful construction. When we were striving for the new constitution of Ecuador, both the critical epidemiology of the definition of health rights and the indigenous knowledge of the summa causa in Quechua, summa causa means wellness or living well, are combined to understand and were combined to discuss the elements of our new constitution. In our university, we are building an innovation platform of teaching, research, and incidents based on these elements of community. I don't have time to. This is one of our programs of Andina Eco Saludable, which is the Eco Healthy Andina, which implies research agency, post-grad and community training and communication strategies, and we're taking that to the city around the university, or for making a space of healthy food provision. So only a rigorous but at the same time compassionate and intercultural science is needed. No more functional governance adapted to the rules of the powerful. And this is both the wisdom of our indigenous grandfathers and grandmothers that say, to strive for life and nature, you need a critical spirit, but also love. Health is built not only from deep justice, but also from deep love. And also this Einstein, that surprises me every day when you rescue the profound thinking of Albert Einstein, critical thinking. He says that our task must be to free ourselves from the prison of considering us isolated from nature and from other human beings. We must be free of this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures. And this implies a philosophy of resilience. Like Mahatma Gandhi said, I will continue to believe even when people lose hope. This is a moment of losing hope, no? It's so terrible, so perverse. I will keep creating even if someone destroys. I will continue talking about peace even in the middle of a war. And I will continue sowing although others tread harvest. Because in the midst of desolation, there will be a child who will look at us hopefully expecting something from us. And even in the middle of a storm, the sun will come from somewhere. Thank you.